Fork in the Road by C.A. Wynn. You're always one choice away from a totally different life. The poster was white with crisp, sleek black lettering. It was clean, certain, composed. Menka liked that. It comforted her, spoke to her, inspired her. There was nothing else in the hallway. No windows, no other posters, not a smudge or mark. Alone, 3 chairs to her left and 3 to her right, Menka felt complete. A scraping sound emanated from the end of the hall to her right. She recognized it as the dragging feet of an occupied chair. The noise was incongruous with her flawless surroundings. As far as she could tell, there was a door near that end of the hall. While she couldn't see it from where she sat, she had the sensation it was there. It was more than a sensation. It was a memory of sorts. Have I been here before? Menka wondered. She was glad the door was out of view. It would have ruined the symmetry. Her left foot slid a few centimeters on the floor, creating yet another scraping sound. Incongruities abounded in this life, brought to sharp contrast in places like this. She glanced around, concerned that someone might have heard her. She was safe. There had been no one to witness it. A totally different life. She whispered the words over and over again. The scraping sound at the end of the hall returned, this time followed by steps, a hand on a doorknob, the creak of a hinge. She closed her eyes, hoping it would go away. When she opened them, she spied a head protruding from the wall near the end of the hall. The head belonged to an older woman with black hair and dark-rimmed glasses stretched across a drawn face. The woman didn't advance further. Her head hung there as though sprung from the wall. She looked around, her eyes briefly settling on Menka. She abruptly pulled back into the room, closing the door behind her. Menka turned to the poster on the wall. One choice, she thought. Always one choice. She'd crossed town on the local shuttle, climbed the many stairs, and sat in this very seat. Each of these was a choice she'd made. Which of them will lead to a totally different life, she wondered. If the poster was to be believed, any or all of them. Menka again heard footsteps. These came from her left. She turned to see a young, beautiful woman round the corner with certainty and confidence. The woman's eyes stared straight before her, resolute. Her steps were even, measured, almost choreographed with the beat of Menka's heart. A real beauty, Menka's mother would have said. As the woman passed, she unsettled the air. Menka watched her turn at the end of the hall, grabbing the unseen knob and disappearing behind the unseen door. Silence again. The poster called to Menka. Crisp black words against solid, stark white. These are words to live by, she thought. The door at the end of the hall opened. Out popped the older woman's face, turned this time toward Menka. Miss Chedda? Cheeto. Yes, that's me. Menka rose and approached as silently as she could. The older woman's head disappeared again. When Menka arrived at the door, she found a small office. In one corner of the space sat the confident young woman who had disturbed the air in the hallway. The older woman motioned toward an empty chair that sat before an empty desk near the center of the room. Please have a seat, Miss Chedda. I'm sorry, Menka said. What are you sorry about, young lady? Asked the older woman. My name isn't Chedda, it's Cheeto. Menka Cheeto. I see. Please have a seat, Miss Menka Cheeto, the older woman said. I am Mrs. Cawthorn. Though it lacked symmetry, the office rivaled the hallway for starkness. 3 simple chairs accompanied the 2 white, clean, and empty desks. The walls lacked any motivational posters. Menka thought this was a glaring oversight. She considered mentioning it before they concluded their business, but dismissed the thought. It would only bring unwelcome attention to her. Mrs. Cawthorn sat down behind the desk, the chair scraping beneath her as she settled. "Miss Chetta, I understand you're interested in a change." "My name is Cheeto, Menka Cheeto. Perhaps you were expecting Miss Chetta. Should I wait outside?" No, my mistake," said the older woman. "You are the person I was looking for. There wasn't anyone else in the hall, was there?" Menka shook her head. Mrs. Cawthorn raised her hands before her, manipulating an unseen device. Menka assumed it was a holographic computer. She'd used them herself, but she hadn't seen one from this side. The device was not visible to her. It almost seemed that there was no device at all. Mrs. Cawthorn's eyes scanned an unseen screen, her hands moving quickly about. "Right. We have many options. Location, occupation, gender. What sort of change were you seeking?" "I'm afraid I don't know," said Menka. "I did know once, I think. Now I don't." Mrs. Cawthorn scanned Menka up and down. She offered a strained smile. "Miss Chetta," she said, "this process would go much more smoothly if you had some idea of the direction." "It's Cheeto," Menka said. "Right, Cheeto," Mrs. Cawthorn said. "Your name appears to be the only thing you are certain of." The young woman rose from her seat in the corner and stepped behind Mrs. Cawthorn. She pointed at the unseen screen. Menka wanted to see what she saw, wanted to know what she knew. This woman was alluring, a tightly woven tapestry of confidence and beauty. She was the embodiment of what the poster promised, a totally different life. Mrs. Cawthorn nodded to the young woman. "Thank you. I think that will be satisfactory." Menka watched the young woman go back to her seat. When she turned again to Mrs. Cawthorn, Menka found stern eyes staring impatiently. She weakly smiled, adjusting herself in the seat. "Miss Chetta, we can recommend several changes," Mrs. Cawthorn said. "Each of these might be significant in itself. Are you prepared for that?" Yes, I am," Menka said, sitting up straighter in her seat. Mrs. Cawthorn squinted at the screen before her. "One of these will do nicely." "I don't know if something so drastic as gender will suit me," said Menka. Mrs. Cawthorn peered over the top of her glasses, which slid down her nose. "Indeed, I might not recommend that," Mrs. Cawthorn said. "However, let me assure you that any change we offer is completely reversible. A gender change may seem unsuitable, as you say, but it is far from permanent." "Oh, I had no idea." Menka pulled her hands closer together, her body tensing, her shoulders drawn in. "We don't expect you to understand these things, Miss Chetta. That's why we are here," said Mrs. Cawthorn. Menka lowered her head, her gaze finding a spot on the floor. "You mentioned occupation. How might you reverse that?" "Beg pardon?" Miss Cawthorn asked. Menka raised her head, but avoided making eye contact. "I mean, assuming I chose to change my occupation." "Yes?" Mrs. Cawthorn asked. "So to speak, a profession or expertise," said Menka. "Yes, that's what we mean by occupation, a competence," said Mrs. Cawthorn. "Well, how would you reverse that?" asked Menka. "I mean, if it didn't fit." "To begin with, Miss Chetta, whatever we recommend will undoubtedly fit. However, should you choose to change again, that would always be possible." "I was just wondering," said Menka. "You mentioned fully reversible." Mrs. Cawthorn raised her eyebrows and pushed her glasses back to the bridge of her nose. "Miss Chetta, I would recommend we not waste any more time parsing my words." "Oh, no, I wouldn't dream of it," said Menka. "The same goes for location," Mrs. Cawthorn said. "There is no way of reversing your location. Once you are there, you could move again, but we can't reverse you having been there, unless we could bring you backward in time. As far as I'm aware, that is not yet an option." The young woman rose again soundlessly. Gliding over to Mrs. Cawthorn, she whispered in her ear. When she'd finished, she turned her back to Menka, slipping effortlessly into her seat. "My apologies, Miss Chetta," Mrs. Cawthorn said. "It appears we are now capable of bringing you backward in time." Menka's eyes opened wide. "Oh my, I had no idea." "No, I suppose you wouldn't." Mrs. Cawthorn held her gaze for several seconds. "If we are done with the questions, I can present you with options." Menka's shoulders rose, her neck falling into them, her head drooping. "Just one more question, if you don't mind." Mrs. Cawthorn stared at her, raising an eyebrow. "It's the matter of time." Menka glanced over to the young woman. "It's just that, well, if you could send me back in time—" "Yes?" Mrs. Cawthorn pressed. "I thought maybe—" said Menka. "Miss Chetta," Mrs. Cawthorn said, "I really do have other things." "Well, what I mean is," said Menka, "if you could send me back in time—" The young woman rose again. This time she held Menka's gaze as she whispered in Mrs. Cawthorn's ear. Her eyes remained on Menka as she backed away and returned to her desk. Mrs. Cawthorn pushed her glasses back and cleared her throat. "Yes, well, it seems we do have the ability to send you back to a point in time. However, this would be that point. We are unable to send you back to, say, your childhood." "How curious," said Menka. "Technology being what it is, I'm sure you understand," Mrs. Cawthorn said. "I'm sorry, I don't," Menka said. Mrs. Cawthorn pulled the glasses from her nose and placed them on the desk in front of her. "You don't, or you can't?" Menka shook her head, her eyes darting around the room. "I'm not certain I understand the question." "If I were to ask you to walk across the ocean, Miss Chetta, you would not be able to do this," Mrs. Cawthorn said. "No amount of trying, mind you. A person simply can't. Now, you may say you don't walk across oceans, which is all well and true. However, you don't because you can't. Here, you're saying you don't understand something. Is that because you can't, or because you've chosen not to?" Menka's face contorted, her eyes tearing up. "I haven't chosen anything yet, have I?" Mrs. Cawthorn rose and approached Menka, placing a hand on her shoulder. It was a familiar gesture, one that reminded Menka of her childhood, when her parents would calm her. She'd since had friends touch her this way as well. Any well-meaning person might act similarly to ease someone's burden, to show support. Mrs. Cawthorn's hand fell to the right place, but it lacked any of the warmth Menka had come to expect from such a display. She found little comfort in the gesture. After a few seconds, Mrs. Cawthorn returned to her seat. "Right, let's get back to business then. Miss Chetta, was there a change you were interested in?" Menka pulled a tissue from her pocket and dabbed at her eyes. "No, I didn't have anything specific in mind," Menka said. "I was hoping to experience the totally different life I read about on the poster in the hall." Mrs. Cawthorn replaced her glasses on the bridge of her nose. Assessing the unseen screen before her, she cleared her throat. "I see. Then I will recommend one or more of these. Let's have a look, shall we?" Menka squeezed the tissue as she adjusted herself in the seat. Her back had bent, and she straightened it. She brushed away the few strands of hair that had fallen across her forehead. As she stuffed the tissue in her pocket, she smiled. "That would be nice, thank you." "The most readily available changes involve scenery," said Mrs. Cawthorn. "What about a nice little cottage along the Italian coast?" "I'm asthmatic. Would that be an issue?" asked Menka. "Yes, well, a Saharan village, perhaps," Mrs. Cawthorn offered. "I'm deathly afraid of sunlight," said Menka. "Really? Well, that would be a problem," said Mrs. Cawthorn. "Perhaps an urban setting, the skyscrapers of Manhattan?" "Claustrophobic," Menka admitted. "Which knocks out travel to a space settlement," Mrs. Cawthorn said. "I'm afraid so," agreed Menka. "Scenery does not appear to offer us many options after all. Mrs. Cawthorn smiled and addressed the unseen screen again. Well, occupational competency is a wide-open arena. We could move you into a technical field. How would you like to learn about designing quantum generators? Menka's face soured again. That may be something I can't do. Can't? Mrs. Cawthorn repeated. Yes, like walking across the ocean, said Menka. Incapable? Mrs. Cawthorn pressed. I'm afraid so, said Menka. We would train you, said Mrs. Cawthorn. If you look in my file, said Menka, you'll find that higher mathematics is not an option for me. It's genetic. Mrs. Cawthorn's head bobbed back, her eyes wide. Yes, I see what you mean. How on earth did someone genetically remove your capacity to grasp logarithmic scales? My great-grandfather was arithmophobic, said Menka. He had his genes altered to address it. Those changes filtered down to me. Fascinating, said Mrs. Cawthorn. An actual fear of numbers? The number 7 in particular, said Menka. As you can appreciate, this keeps me from pursuing any career in engineering. I see. Mrs. Cawthorn looked over the top of her glasses. She held Menka's gaze for several more uncomfortable seconds. Yes, well, that's hardly our only option. Menka shifted in her chair. I should tell you about my other limitations. Limitations? Mrs. Cawthorn asked. What might they be? At the age of 6, Menka broke off, her eyes darting around. No, 7. Does accuracy really matter in this case? Mrs. Cawthorn asked. It's the number 7, said Menka. As I just mentioned, I have a sort of blindness to it. Genetically altered, said Mrs. Cawthorn. Yes, I wouldn't know how they did it, said Menka. No, I don't suppose you would. Mrs. Cawthorn stole a glance toward the confident young woman. Turning her head back, Mrs. Cawthorn scanned her unseen screen. Please, continue. Continue? Asked Menka. You mentioned limitations, Mrs. Cawthorn said. It would help me to know them before I recommend any more options. Right. Menka shifted again in her seat, stealing a glance at the young woman. Well, to begin with, when I was 6. I believe we determined that you were 7, said Mrs. Cawthorn. Right, said Menka. When I was 7, I was given a pet hamster. A hamster? Asked Mrs. Cawthorn. One of the little furry things, Menka said. I couldn't decide on a name for the creature. I settled on something odd. My father insisted he would never call the hamster by the name I chose. Miss Chetta, Mrs. Cawthorn sighed. Does this story have a point? I'm coming to that, said Menka. I wanted to name the hamster King. My father insisted that was a dog's name. I believe people used to name their dogs King, said Mrs. Cawthorn. Right, well, my father said the hamster would never learn its name because it was a dog's name, said Menka. Mrs. Cawthorn tilted her head, a half smile on her face. Did your father assume the hamster knew it was not a dog? Menka's forehead furrowed. I guess so, she said. I've never thought of it that way. Miss Chetta, Mrs. Cawthorn said, can we please get to the point where this becomes a limitation on you? Well, I was only 6, Menka said. 7, Mrs. Cawthorn corrected. Menka stood, shaking her head. Yes, I was 7. Right, I keep forgetting. She began to pace around the room. She hated pacing. It was something people did when they didn't know what else to do. As she worked her way around the office, Menka's eyes fell periodically to the woman in the corner. I was 7, and my father wouldn't call my hamster by his name. Only the animal wasn't a he. King was a she. Mrs. Cawthorn rose to her feet. So you're saying you named a female hamster with a male dog's name? Yes, it's all confused, said Menka. I was confused. I still am. These things should already be in my file. If they are not, we can remedy that, Mrs. Cawthorn said. Won't you please sit down? Let's continue our discussion. Menka's pace accelerated. I'm here to make a choice. I want to choose a better life, like your poster says. Menka stopped suddenly, her eyes darting around the room. She looked to Mrs. Cawthorn, then to the young woman in the corner. Did you just laugh? Menka asked. The young woman looked up, acting as though she hadn't been aware of Menka's presence. Her forehead creased, her head slightly askew. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. I heard you laughing, Menka shouted. Why would I laugh at you? The young woman asked. The woman's voice triggered something, the shadow of a memory, like the door at the end of the hall. Menka had heard her voice before. Not only that, she had seen this place, been here. Mrs. Cawthorn was also familiar, if only she could remember. Menka gathered herself and returned to her seat, sitting down heavily. She crossed her arms and stared at the young woman. Miss Chetta, said Mrs. Cawthorn. Menka's head turned abruptly, her eyes now daggers for Mrs. Cawthorn. It's Cheeto, Menka shouted. It's always been Cheeto. There is absolutely no reason to strike such a tone with me, young lady, said Mrs. Cawthorn. Tears welled up in Menka's eyes. She extracted the tissue from her pocket and applied it to her reddening face. I'm a mess, aren't I? The chair scraped the floor as she shifted in her seat. Menka's shoulders slumped. She closed her eyes. After a few moments, she felt Mrs. Cawthorn's hand again. It was stiff and cold, an empty gesture devoid of empathy. This feeling was also familiar to Menka, something she'd experienced before this day. Menka considered pulling her shoulders away, but couldn't muster the courage. After some time, Mrs. Cawthorn left her, returning to the seat behind the desk. Well then, shall we continue? Mrs. Cawthorn asked. Menka nodded and replaced the tissue in her pocket. We have hardly exhausted all of our options, Mrs. Cawthorn said, a smile spreading across her face. I think I've chosen, said Menka. Mrs. Cawthorn stopped short and looked at her. You've decided? Wonderful! What would you like to try? I'd like to go back to who I was before, said Menka. Before? Mrs. Cawthorn asked. Yes, before. I want to go back to who I was, said Menka. I'm afraid I don't understand, Mrs. Cawthorn said. I'm not sure I understand either, said Menka. She took in a deep breath. I only know that I've been here before. I've seen the two of you. I don't know how or when. Young lady, Mrs. Cawthorn said, I'm sure I would remember. It's fuzzy, said Menka, but I have been here. It's something I can only half remember. Like the number 7? Asked the young woman, a sinister sneer on her face. Menka pointed at her. You know something you're not telling me. She turned toward Mrs. Cawthorn, an accusation in her stare. You know it too, even if you won't say. Mrs. Cawthorn crossed her arms. Perhaps you could enlighten us. Maybe, but I can't remember for sure, said Menka. Can't or won't? Asked the young woman. Menka glared at her, anger welling up. Something elusive nibbled at her. The young woman was somehow familiar, not what she seemed. Who on earth has a blindness for the number 7? The young woman continued. And naming your gerbil after a dog? It was a hamster, said Menka. Well, at least you got that part right, said the young woman. Menka's heart raced. She could feel her fingernails biting into her palms. Her breathing quickened. Her tears flowed. What are you not telling me? Young lady, Mrs. Cawthorn hissed. Menka had heard those words spoken in precisely that way before. She'd experienced this very room, this same exchange. It had all happened before. How or when, she didn't know. That it had was no longer in doubt. Menka had devolved into great wrenching sobs. Her body shook with them. After several minutes of this, she tried to settle herself. She was alone, a tense ball of anxiety and anger, calming herself in the otherwise silent room. As she focused, her memories began to clear. Faces and voices started to populate them. Feelings and impressions began to fill in the gaps. Menka opened her eyes and let her cold stare fall on Mrs. Cawthorn. I want you to remember back. It's only a few days ago, I think. You wore the same lilac perfume, the one that usually makes me sneeze. There was a light breeze outside. No clouds. Of course, we don't get many clouds here. What we get are the sad and lonely, the dispossessed, the vanquished. How do I know this? Menka pointed to the corner. The young woman looked increasingly less confident as Menka spoke. Because a few days ago, I was sitting right where she is. You remember it, don't you? Menka stood and walked over to the young woman. What's the matter? Don't have much to say? You didn't that day either. Little mouse of a thing, lost, lonely, insecure, talking obsessively about the poster on the wall, 7 chairs neatly placed in the middle of the hallway. Menka swept her arm toward the door. Couldn't even walk in on your own. We practically carried you, set you down, buttered you up. Then you asked for it, didn't you? Finally got around to making a choice. If the young woman could retreat into her chair, she made every effort to do so. She flinched at each word from Menka's mouth. Looking helplessly toward Mrs. Cawthorn, she appeared on the verge of tears. How did you put it? Menka asked. You pointed at me as if I were the floor model of a new appliance. I want to be her, you said. You didn't mean being like me. You meant actually to be me. The young woman finally broke, her face red through her hands, sobs racking her body. Mrs. Cawthorn moved to the corner and stood behind the young woman. Don't you think you've done enough? Her eyes were full of rage. You see what you've done to her? Her? Shouted Menka. I'm the victim. I'm the one who was wronged. You took my life from me, gave it to her. She made a choice, said Mrs. Cawthorn. It's what we do here, or have you forgotten that? Menka dismissed her with a wave. Her choice was to take my life. How is that okay? We are supposed to make lives better, not trade one for another. The young woman slumped over, her face falling into her hands. If anything, I didn't appreciate how very weak you were, said Menka. The stories, the history, everything about you is confused and afraid. You're a joke, an afterthought. You can't even count to 10. It's genetic, cried the young woman through her hands. The number 7? Who can't remember the number 7? Asked Menka. Miss Chetta, Mrs. Cawthorn snapped. It's Cheeto, Menka said. You know it's Cheeto. She pointed at the young woman. I sat in that seat for the last 4 years. My name hasn't changed. Only everything else about me has. This is entirely inappropriate, Mrs. Cawthorn said. Inappropriate? Menka stepped back and presented herself, her hands out to her sides. No more than taking away my life and leaving me with this. That is quite enough, young lady, said Mrs. Cawthorn. Menka stared at Mrs. Cawthorn, her breath whistling through clenched teeth. She gathered her hands into fists and held them up defiantly. I want my life back. Out of the question, said Mrs. Cawthorn. Menka's eyes grew still larger. What about reversing? You promised you could reverse things. Yes, we can, said Mrs. Cawthorn. Only you didn't make the choice. She did. She hasn't asked to reverse it. She's happy with her new life. Of course she is. Look at her, said Menka. She's beautiful, successful, and no longer a freak. Mrs. Cawthorn stepped toward her desk. That sort of language is uncalled for. I don't care, said Menka. She has my life, and I want it back. Mrs. Cawthorn reached for the unseen screen and pressed something. You can't have it back, Miss Cheetah, Mrs. Cawthorn said. She made a choice. You don't get to change it. The room fell silent except for the sobs of the young woman. Menka stared in disbelief, unsure what to do next. When the door opened behind her, she didn't move. She knew they had come for her, and it didn't help to resist. As unseen hands pulled her from the room, she stared longingly at the desk where she'd once lived a different life. Choices are the only hinges of destiny. The poster was white with crisp, sleek black lettering. It was clean, certain, composed. Menka liked that. It comforted her, spoke to her, inspired her. End of Fork in the Road by C.A.Wynn.